began with a scream. Baltimore, July 1931. The whimpering came from the cramped bedroom, barely audible over the sound of traffic and the neighbors' arguments outside. Mary Ellis rushed in and found her son, Joseph, curled on the dirty floor, clutching his head, sobbing. "I can't see, Mama. I can't see." The sun beat through the window in pale squares, but Joseph's world was fading fast. Everything was smeared in grayness, shapes melting, the room a shadowy prison. A week later, Mary grasped Joseph's hand as they waited in line at the city hospital, behind coughing men and crying babies. The nurse looked them up and down, black mother, trembling boy in patched clothes. "Next," she called, barely glancing. They sat across from Dr. Anderson, who shined a light into Joseph's eyes and delivered his verdict. "Retinal degeneration, most likely. No cure. He'll be blind within months." He scribbled a note. No treatment, no hope. The nurse ushered them out. Mary's legs buckled. Joseph clung to her waist and wept. Night after night, Joseph's terror grew. He woke Mary to darkness that felt alive. "Help me, Mama." But there was no help. No specialists willing to treat a black child at Johns Hopkins. No public programs for disabled children in Baltimore. In 1931, poverty and race sealed Joseph's fate. He was invisible, expendable, unteachable. On the street, Mary tried to enroll Joseph in the neighborhood school. The principal, a tall white man, didn't even stand. "We can't take blind children," he said flatly, "and certainly not now." Mary begged, voice rising, tears streaming down her face in the crowded office. "He can learn! He needs a chance!" Other parents pretended not to hear. The principal ushered them out. "Try the church. If you have faith, maybe God will help," he said with a sneer. That night, Mary sat at the kitchen table, Joseph asleep in her lap. She stared at his hands, soft, searching, desperate for the world he could no longer see. She held a battered Bible and a box of sewing pins. Inspiration struck. Mary pressed a pin through cardboard, spelling out letters, guiding Joseph's fingers until he felt the bump. A, then B, then C. She invented her own tactile alphabet long before anyone taught her. Every night, she worked in darkness, driven by hope and rage and fierce, tireless love. In summer, a photographer offered a free family portrait as part of a city charity drive. Mary dressed Joseph in his best clothes, patched trousers, shoes borrowed from a cousin. In the photographer's studio, Joseph's head drooped against Mary's shoulder, his open eyes uncertain. The flash exploded. Mary blinked, remembering the doctor's words. "Soon he'll live in shadow." But she refused to surrender. She wanted a record, proof that Joseph was here, that he mattered. Decades later, the photograph would travel to Johns Hopkins, still haunting in its simplicity. Dr. Evelyn Chase held it under harsh museum light, transfixed by the boy's vacant stare, the mother's rigid arm. She had analyzed thousands of historic portraits, but never felt one like this. She scanned the image, zoomed in, noticed the cloudy iris, the uncertain grip, the way Joseph's fingers curled obsessively on his mother's wrist. She saw not just blindness, but the raw, living terror of a child exiled from the world, fighting for a future against a city that refused to help. Evelyn called Robert Ellis, Joseph's son. His voice cracked. "My father told me he could only see shapes. Grandma Mary taught him to read at night with cardboard and pins. She never gave up." Evelyn searched Baltimore's records, finding a 1932 transcript where Mary Ellis faced the school board alone, demanding justice. "My child deserves to learn. You will not erase him." They denied her. Her response became legend in African American history centers. The defiant mother who invented her own education system when none existed. Survival became rebellion. Mary gathered neighborhood children, teaching them tactile letters and numbers from her kitchen. Joseph grew up memorizing words by touch, reading through darkness, driven by fierce loyalty to his mother. He became a teacher himself for blind children in segregated Baltimore. He spent his life giving sight to others, Robert said, because one woman wouldn't let the world forget him. Evelyn placed the photograph in a museum case, tears stinging her eyes. She looked again, Mary's jaw clenched, Joseph's hands uncertain. The room behind them, a battlefield. In 1931, it was just one image among thousands, but for those who know how to see, it is a war cry of hope and fury. One scream, one mother, one impossible fight, and the photograph that became their shield against oblivion. Baltimore, August 1931. The sun burned out as Sarah Johnson dragged herself home, hands raw from scrubbing stairs in houses she'd never afford. Her shoes left muddy prints on the kitchen floor. She didn't care. All that mattered was the night, a time when William could learn, when her own hope felt possible. William waited, shoulders hunched by the kitchen table. His eyes watered, struggling to adjust in the half-lit room, but the darkness made the world less cruel. "Ready, Mama?" he asked, voice trembling. Sarah nodded, fighting the ache in her arms, and pulled out a sheet of cardboard riddled with tiny punctures. Tonight, she would teach him the alphabet, tactile learning she invented with little more than pins, flour paste, and her will to keep William's mind alive. "Feel this," she said gently, guiding William's hands over a raised bump. "That's A. Here's B. See, 2 bumps close together?" William smiled faintly, his fingers moving slowly as the lessons unfolded. For him, letters weren't lines or ink. They were mountains and valleys beneath his touch. Outside, the city fell into its nightly rhythm, distant laughter, sirens, a car backfiring. Sarah hated daytime, the world's harsh judgment, the principal's sneer, the way neighbors whispered lost cause. At night, she transformed their battered home into a classroom, a sanctuary against defeat and despair. William learned faster than she dreamed. By the end of the month, he was tracing each letter, spelling hope and fight, before collapsing with exhaustion. Sarah lived in constant fatigue, measuring each day in chores she could fit between lessons. She scavenged for materials, used buttons, discarded factory flour sacks, broken bottles. Every payday she visited Enoch Pratt Library, convincing a soft-hearted librarian to loan her stacks of children's books, even when she couldn't afford the deposit. She memorized passages, rehearsed them as she cleaned, then recited every story by lamplight for William, whose vacant eyes seemed to light up at the sound. News of Sarah's kitchen school spread quietly among church friends. Word got around, and soon other mothers came, knocking with children who couldn't speak, couldn't see, couldn't sit still in a room full of sighted strangers. Sarah had no teaching certificate. Her method was faith, improvisation, and fierce love. "If the world doesn't want these children, I do," she said to a skeptical neighbor. Sometimes the house buzzed with activity. Pins stuck through cardboard sheets, flour paste drying on Braille-style pages, prayers whispered over trembling hands. Sarah turned maps into sandboxes, bottle caps into counting games, melodies into math. William blossomed, his sense of touch sharpening into a lifeline. When the pain was too much, he cried. Sarah dried his tears, promising that knowledge, once learned, could never be taken away. But progress came at a cost. Sarah fell ill one winter. She got back up, coughing blood into handkerchiefs, and returned to teaching that night. William's vision failed further, forcing him to rely even more on the feeling of her hands and the patterns she traced. Some nights, he stayed up practicing the alphabet by moonlight, determined not to let darkness win. Setbacks were everywhere. A city official came once, grumbling about permits, and was met at the door by Sarah, standing strong in her patched dress. "You can take my kitchen, but you can't take my son's future," she said, and slammed the door in his face. She wrote dozens of letters to the school board, church leaders, and local doctors. Most were returned unopened or marked "No such program." An old friend, Miss Lewis, visited to see William recite psalms from memory. He stood trembling, unable to see the crowd, but his voice filled the church with hope. Miss Lewis left in tears, sending Sarah a note. "You teach what the world forgets. Your work gives me faith." Sarah persuaded a former employer to donate a battered piano. William learned music in the dark, his hands finding the keys and the songs by feel alone. She encouraged him to play for neighbors, their small apartment filling with music at dusk, giving anyone who listened a taste of triumph amid the city's neglect. By autumn, Sarah's kitchen was known across Upton, Sharp Street, and the parishes downtown. Mothers traded stories. Children learned to map Baltimore by memory, by sound, by feel. William wrote songs about overcoming darkness. Sarah's tiny kitchen, the same one where dignitaries never stepped, became the beacon that even daylight couldn't diminish. She taught beyond her own son, opening doors to strangers, giving blind and disabled children a place to belong. At times, guilt gnawed at her. Was she pushing William too far? Each time she faltered, William reassured her. "I want to learn, Mama. If you teach me, I'll teach someone else." William was 11 when he began helping Sarah teach. Together, they guided children younger than him, passing down tactile alphabets, sand maps, and music lessons. Sarah's late-night perseverance sparked a movement. Families gathered beneath her lamp, neighbors in awe of the change spreading from one determined woman. Not all neighbors were supportive. Some gossiped, warning Sarah that she was neglecting her health, investing too much in a child who would never thrive. Sarah answered by inviting more children in. "Blind children can't be saved," they said. She pressed the pins deeper, her lessons louder, her pride unbreakable. Hard years followed. When Sarah's fever worsened, church friends brought food, and William led lessons himself, guiding his mother to her own seat. No institution would claim their success, but the network Sarah formed out of necessity endured, binding mothers against shame, forging champions in hidden kitchens. Archival records Evelyn Chase studied, decades later, told of Sarah's tenacity. Her battered notebook, rescued from a trash bin years later, lists recipes for tactile lessons, borrowed math stories, and Sunday school tunes. She read the council's letters refusing permits, traced the faded signatures of parents who witnessed Sarah's magic, and signed their children's names in hope. Sarah taught and fought with every breath, determined to give William and others what the city would not. In her kitchen, failure was not an option. The night school persisted, not because of charity, but because love demanded it. Decades later, Evelyn stands in Baltimore's archives, holding Sarah's notes and William's childhood Bible. The pages are brittle, but their truth endures. Resistance, she sees, is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet persistence each night, the gentle clink of pins on cardboard, the relentless will to teach through darkness, so that one child and his generation might one day step into the light. For Sarah and William, knowledge was their revolution. Every lesson learned in that kitchen remains a living reminder. The world may hide its heroes in shadow, unless someone dares to teach, love, and fight through the night. Dawn broke over Druid Hill Avenue as Sarah Johnson guided William's thin fingers along the Braille alphabet she dotted onto cardboard with a dull sewing pin. The memory of rejection after rejection haunted every morning. Letters returned unopened, principals refusing him, city officials dismissing his existence. William was 12, eyes clouding with pain, his future buried beneath poverty, and a diagnosis no one cared to understand. Sarah endured it all. 6 days a week, she worked in Roland Park, humbly scrubbing floors and dusting bookshelves for Baltimore's wealthy. At night, with the city asleep, she taught her son tactile math on cracked plates, poetry in whispered phrases, history by candle and sweat. The world wanted William isolated, but Sarah made their kitchen a bridge to possibility. William grew restless. Baltimore was changing. Neighbors moved away when the Great Depression cut deeper. Sarah clung to her new community, other mothers and children excluded by schools and stigmatized by church elders. By 1935, her kitchen school had blossomed into a nighttime refuge for the neighborhood's disabled and overlooked. Mothers crowded the cramped room, swapping recipes, sorrow, and hope as their children learned by touch and song. One night a stranger arrived, Miss Lewis, a city teacher drawn by rumors of Sarah's miracle lessons. She observed William reciting Psalm 23 from memory, his hands clutching the battered Bible for reassurance. Tears glistened in Miss Lewis's eyes as she watched Sarah guide him, speaking gently, never letting society's darkness define them. Before she left, she pressed a note into Sarah's hand. "You teach what the world forgets. You are the difference between a future and a shadow." Encouraged, Sarah forced the public eye onto William's achievements. She arranged church recitations, wrote to city council, and demanded that the local newspaper document the night school miracle. Some praised her, others whispered that she was delusional. Church leaders debated whether she was undermining tradition with her defiant activism. Sarah, undeterred, hosted larger community evenings, her kitchen at the epicenter of a quiet revolution. But in 1938, disaster struck. William, nearly 16, collapsed in agony, fire in his eyes, pain radiating into his temples. Baltimore City Hospital admitted him to the segregated ward, a hostile environment where white doctors murmured medical terms but offered little hope. Acute glaucoma, they said, congenital aniridia, no treatment. Sarah argued, pleaded, even threatened legal action, to no avail. William's sight deteriorated. By spring he was blind in both eyes. Grief gripped Sarah, but she fought for her son's dignity. She apprenticed herself at the Maryland Workshop for the Blind, learning broom making and caning alongside William. Each morning she walked him to the reliable broom company, then continued cleaning for others. William adapted as quickly as he could, driven by the same stubbornness Sarah had instilled. He learned Braille fluently, performed music by memory, and taught disabled adults his methods. The workshop's monthly newsletters featured William's achievements. Completes daily quota in half the usual time. Teaches self-made tactile techniques to all new arrivals. His optimism became legendary, as did Sarah's devotion. They became symbols of Baltimore's resilience, a mother and son who refused surrender. Together they organized church concerts, social dances for the blind, and vocal recitals in Sharp Street Memorial Methodist Church. Still, darkness encroached. War arrived in Europe, and Baltimore's labor force shifted toward new industries. By 1943, William was hired at the Glenn L. Martin Aircraft Company for wartime assembly. Outstanding tactile sensitivity, recommended for precision work, the record read. Sarah worried each day, but William proved himself, building aircraft parts that would fly in distant battles. He contributed to the war effort with hands that had learned resilience through heartbreak. After the war, the city changed. Employment records dried up, and William's name disappeared for a while. Sarah continued to fight, writing letters to the National Federation of the Blind, seeking self-advocacy networks, pressing for workshops, and teaching positions. Finally, a lead emerged. William was accepted to the New York Institute for the Education of the Blind. Sarah sent him north with only a train ticket and prayers. Now 24, William was on his own. Sarah, too tired to leave her job, visited when she could, sending food, letters, love. In New York, William excelled, learning advanced piano by ear, teaching music to blind children, marrying a fellow teacher named Dorothy. Eventually, Sarah retired, moving north to be with her son and his growing family. William taught for decades, shaping generations in Harlem with music and his mother's defiant lessons. Meanwhile, Evelyn Chase traced their journey, piecing together census records, letters, employment logs, workshop newsletters, and oral histories. Decades after their struggle, she held evidence of a legacy. Sarah's devotion had destroyed the myth that disability meant worthlessness, and that poverty was a terminal sentence. William lived through massive changes. He witnessed civil rights marches, school reform, and even the integration of disability education. His daughters grew up with stories of a grandmother who would not let her son disappear, who made kitchen tables, classrooms, and broom factories places of pride. Sarah passed in 1968. Her last years spent listening to William play piano for her granddaughters. When William died in 1992, the church in Harlem filled beyond capacity. Students, colleagues, daughters, grandchildren, activists. They remembered his words. Disability is not limitation. It's a different way to see the world. The photograph from 1931 remained the anchor. Sarah's arms around William as he stared bravely into the uncertain light. Evelyn placed the image at the heart of an exhibit, telling their story so no child like William would ever be called unteachable again. The chapter closes with the echo of Sarah's kitchen songs and William's chords filling a museum hall. Their struggle a permanent reminder. Loving fiercely and teaching stubbornly can rewrite history, even in the darkest times. Baltimore, autumn 1992. The historic church on Harlem's 125th Street overflowed for William's funeral. Hundreds of students, teachers, neighbors, and old friends packed pews in silent tribute. Evelyn Chase sat near the back, notebook open, overwhelmed by the living legacy before her eyes. She'd come hoping to finish her research on Sarah and William, a simple photo, an untold struggle, but found herself witness to history remade by a single family's fight. William's daughter, Angela, stood at the pulpit, voice steady. My father believed the world must change one stubborn lesson at a time. Grandma Sarah taught him, then he taught all of us, that even when others refuse to see you, you can teach them to look again. She played a fragment of gospel on the battered piano William left behind, keys worn smooth by decades of blind fingers. Evelyn's archival hunt for evidence had spanned over a year. She'd followed Sarah's life through census registers, old workshop payrolls, handwritten school petitions. What began as a diagnosis from an old photograph had become an obsessive pursuit, a quest for records that could prove Sarah's night school wasn't fiction or faded memory. Evelyn found city council minutes from 1934, where community members argued about Johnson's illegal school. One white councilman complained, "She's causing trouble," but others quietly praised how children from Upton Street were finally learning. Year by year, Angela's stories filled in the gaps. Sarah's kitchen school inspired other mothers to open their homes, forging a grassroots movement. Evelyn uncovered correspondence between Sarah and the Maryland Workshop for the Blind. "I want my son to work, train him for dignity, not pity." In 1952, William led the first music class for blind students ever held by a public school in Baltimore. He became a teacher against all odds. The city's education archives yielded student rosters with William's name, followed by 3 columns marked "Exceptional Progress." Newspaper clippings, yellowed with age, featured brief articles: "Blind music teacher performs for mayor." "Children learn by finger and ear." Evelyn held tangible proof Sarah and William's story wasn't just oral legend, but documented change. Angela described growing up amid both celebration and struggle. Dad taught students of all backgrounds, black, white, sighted, disabled. There were times he wasn't paid for months, but he taught anyway. Grandma said, "The lesson is the payment." Evelyn wrote it down, struck by the weight of those words. Evidence came alive through objects too: Sarah's notebook, now cracked and fragile, annotated with nightly lessons; William's Bible, page edges marked from lifelong reading by touch; a battered cardboard alphabet, pins still embedded, surviving the decades. Evelyn photographed everything in painstaking detail. These were not just relics, but artifacts of a rebellion in slow motion. But the evidence wasn't always welcome. In 1975, a school principal tried to erase references to Sarah's work from a textbook, insisting what she did wasn't official. Angela's mother, Dorothy, staged a protest at the school board, holding up William's battered piano keys before the press. "You will not erase my family's struggle." The story made local news, igniting debate about whether homegrown acts of resistance belonged in history lessons. Evelyn traced the ripple effect. By the late 1980s, city disability programs regularly cited community-based learning, models Sarah had refined in her kitchen half a century earlier. Mothers across Baltimore acknowledged Sarah as their inspiration. Newspaper retrospectives called her the blind teacher's mother. William's students went on to found advocacy organizations, several gaining national recognition. Angela donated a final artifact, a faded family photograph of Sarah and William after World War II, both smiling in the glow of their Harlem apartment. Evelyn placed it next to the original 1931 portrait. The progression from suffering to triumph, obscurity to legacy. Academics grew interested, publishing articles in education journals about Sarah Johnson's night school model and William Johnson, pioneer for blind education reform. Evelyn presented her findings at Johns Hopkins, the irony bitter. The same institution that once refused Sarah's son, now celebrated her work as foundational. The audience, a mixture of professors, students, and Sarah's great-grandchildren, sat transfixed. Angela, her voice stronger now, concluded the funeral with a simple truth. My family kept evidence alive because heroes aren't made by institutions. They're forged in the darkness and taught by the stubborn love that refuses to quit. Evelyn ended her research with final fieldwork. Revisiting the crumbling row house on Upton Street, now decrepit, nearly lost to time, she stood in the empty kitchen, touching the marks left from generations before. Faded lines on the wall where Sarah measured her son's growth, deep grooves on the table from nightly lessons. She left a copy of Sarah's notebook, laminated and safe, for whoever might someday rediscover it. Her museum exhibit chronicled the journey from invisibility to impact. Sarah's defiance, William's artistry, and the chain of evidence that proved their story mattered. Photos, documents, letters, and that cardboard alphabet shone under glass, living proof of a legacy others tried to erase. The chapter closes with Evelyn's reflection. Evidence isn't just paper. It's the voice of the forgotten, the melody of hope, the fingerprints on every lesson that survives. The world may forget, but the evidence endures. Sarah and William's struggle was never simply personal. It rewrote how Baltimore saw blindness, education, and the power of one parent's battle to be heard. The school, the music, the movement, these were evidence that endures forever, shining against the darkness. Washington, D.C., Spring 2024. The atrium of the National Museum of African American History and Culture glowed under angled glass, sunlight tracing the edges of a new exhibit. Evelyn Chase stood among schoolchildren, families, and scholars gathered around a photograph. Sarah Johnson, 1931, holding her son William in a desperate embrace. At its heart, the image radiated pride, fear, and resistance. Visitors paused, transfixed, as Evelyn watched history ripple into the present. She had arrived at this moment only after years of searching, scanning, decoding, and tracing every thread in the tapestry of Sarah and William's lives. Their story had shifted from an anonymous portrait in a box of forgotten donations to centerpiece of a national dialogue. The curators displayed more than just the photo. They presented tactile alphabets, Sarah's battered notebook, William's employment records, and audio of church music recorded by his students in Harlem. The effect was visceral. Maya Johnson, William's granddaughter, explained to a news crew, "When I see my great-grandmother's face, I see every mother who ever fought for her child's worth. This isn't just family. It's our country's hidden truth." The museum's narrative did not shy away from ugliness. Letters from school boards denying admission, hospital records refusing care, pay stubs for relentless labor. Yet, it balanced pain with triumph. Children reciting poetry, community activism, piano music, love that broke barriers. Angela, William's daughter, spoke at the opening. "My father told us blindness was not a curse, but a way of seeing the world differently. Grandma Sarah gave him a world when everyone else tried to take it away. Their courage shaped lives none of you will ever see." Evelyn walked among visitors, listening to debates and questions. Parents brought their own children, explaining how disability could spark invention. Younger advocates marveled at the impact one determined woman had on public education reform. Sarah's kitchen school stood as a model for hundreds of grassroots programs across America. William's example as Baltimore's first blind music teacher inspired generations. Media coverage exploded. Journalists traveled to Baltimore and Harlem, interviewing elders who still remembered Sarah's night lessons and William's music recitals. Civil rights historians cited the Johnsons in books and articles on resistance. Local schools brought entire classes to view the artifacts, encouraging students to write essays about obstacles and endurance. Yet for the family, the legacy was never just public. David, William's grandson, became a professor of music at a university near Baltimore. He described growing up with stories of cardboard alphabets and perseverance, recalling, "Grandpa's songs always started in the darkness before dawn. He said that's when you can feel all the beauty you don't see." Evelyn stayed in touch with the family, collecting new artifacts, letters, audio tapes, annotated music scores from William's years teaching in Harlem. She created guidelines for other historians: search for hidden faces, read between the lines, ask survivors to fill the silence left by official paperwork. During a symposium on historical documentation, Evelyn addressed students and researchers. What matters isn't just evidence, but empathy. Sarah was erased by policymakers. William was rejected by doctors. Still, their courage left fingerprints everywhere, on tactile alphabets, school petitions, workshop records, and the hearts of those in their orbit. Sarah Johnson's legacy flourished. Mothers and teachers nationwide cited her as inspiration, founding new programs for blind and disabled children. Urban libraries displayed her story, updating teaching manuals to include the Johnson method, home-based tactile and sensory learning. Policy activists lobbied for greater funding, winning improvements for special education and community health centers in Baltimore and Harlem. In the final weeks of her project, Evelyn reflected in her journal. She described the living power of artifacts, a photograph outlasting despair, a notebook defying bureaucracy, a piano echoing through time. She wrote, "Every loving act, every stubborn lesson taught in darkness, is a revolution with ripples no census will ever trace." On the exhibit's closing day, William's great-grandchildren returned, standing before the enlarged portrait of Sarah and William. Maya, now a physician, whispered, "We will remember you both, with every patient, every song, every lesson." Evelyn understood that her role as keeper of history was only a beginning. New artifacts, new photos, more stories of ordinary heroism waited in museums, homes, and memory. She scanned, archived, and wrote, making invisible lives visible, holding space for every mother's act of resistance. As dusk fell over the museum, the light on Sarah and William's photo softened, her hand unbending, his shoulders brave. Their legacy endured not just in exhibits or records, but in classrooms, advocacy, and music that filled the last gaps of a world once blind to their existence. That night, Evelyn closed her notes and stared at the photograph one more time. Sarah's eyes, fierce and loving, seemed to say, "We were here. We mattered. And until the world sees every child, our fight goes on."